Okay, I think that's a good stopping point there. Hello, everyone. I imagine there'll be some more people that trickle in here, but we can go ahead and I think get started. My name is Iris Williamson. I'm one of the directors at Holding Contemporary, and along with Tiffany Harker, who will also be speaking and doing an intro. But I just wanted to start by recognizing that Holding Contemporary is on the unceded lands of Multnomah, Chinook, Clackamas, Cowlitz, Clatskanie, Kalopia, Tualatin, and other Indigenous peoples. So I just wanted to begin by recognizing that. Tiffany?
Hi, everyone. Well, thanks for joining us. I am Tiffany Harker. I run Holding Contemporary with Iris Williamson, and our current exhibition, Cumulative Shadow, is on view through May 29th. And this is our second exhibition with Jovencio de la Paz. And we're so happy to have them here to talk about their work with us today. Jovencio will be hosting the presentation and sharing images and talking about their process and studio practice, specifics about the series included in the exhibition. And all exhibitions are best viewed in person, but the scale and exquisite details of these works make the show especially important to experience in the physical space of the gallery. I know some of you here have already seen it and stopped by, but you haven't, you can make an appointment through our homepage. So Jovencio's work always reveals this deep engagement with cultural and historical considerations. and the histories embedded in materials, as well as analog and digital exchange. Um, the their recent artworks explored tensions and collaborations between the digital and physical realms, and excited to have them speak about that. Jovencio is an artist, a writer, an educator, currently assistant professor and curricular head of fibers at University of Oregon. They create specialized design software, working with algorithms and computational creativity through the TC2 loom, a hand-operated electronic jacquard loom that allows digital input for imagery, and the making is controlled by the hand and allows for intervention by the artist. One of the series in our exhibition was made through the programming tools that are intended to grow and evolve weave structures and create self-generating textiles. And you can find more biographical information about Jovencio through our website. And before we begin, just a reminder to mute yourselves, and you're welcome to add questions in the chat, and Iris can read those at the end. We'll have a Q&A portion. So we are excited to welcome Jovencio to share their presentation with us today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for using your precious Saturday afternoon to hear me talk about this new work. I'm going to go through also some biographical and contextual information. Two things sort of happened to me in the last 6 months, which caused me to rewrite my artist talk. And the first is I was up for tenure. And those of you who have been through that academic process, it is, of course, so much work in the kind of, in the writing and in all of the kind of bureaucratic hoops you have to jump through. But also there's a kind of personal labor of reevaluating one's life and one's activity over many, many years. And then the other thing, I was lucky enough to hear a lecture from the painter Rebecca Morris, who was so inspiring to me in terms of her commitment to kind of the idiosyncrasies of an artist's life and how to sort of forefront that as an important kind of information. And it's something I really don't do, I've noticed. And so I thought I would use this as an opportunity to experiment a little bit and reflect with you where I've come from and where things are going now in my practice. Before I begin, I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Eugene, Oregon, which is the traditional homeland of the Kayapua Elihi tribe here in Eugene. And the tribe continues to be incredible contributors to our culture and innovations in education, science, technology, and the arts in the region. So I'll go ahead now and share my screen. I was born in the People's Republic of Singapore in the early 80s. And I want to talk a little bit about my experience as an immigrant coming to the US. My father was a geologist, and I always think it's so interesting. In the late 70s, early 80s, geology was like a very hot job for young people in Southeast Asia, which sounds strange, but they had discovered oil, throughout the Indonesian archipelago. And so that was a very lucrative kind of career to be engaged in. So we moved around a lot. I was born in Singapore. We lived in Jakarta for quite a bit of time, but political kind of shifts and changes in the region, challenging sort of political shifts, brought us to immigrate to the US. I was very young, and it was a very shocking experience, I think, for my family coming from, extraordinarily dense urban Southeast Asian environment to an environment like this. This is a view outside my bedroom window in Gresham, Oregon, very, very agricultural, rural landscape. admittedly very bucolic and lovely place to grow up, but also a very troubled and violent place for people of color, for a very young queer person, bleak in one sense, but also kind of a ripe place for, I think, introspection as a young person. But yeah, you know, these were the kinds of, this was my neighbor, Sean Miller's barn, where we would get stoned sometimes. I have these experiences of, you know, kind of extraordinary beauty in the landscape, but also the fraught reality of being like the only person of color and a queer person in school. And, you know, I was a target of a lot of violence. This was the mega church that was down the street from our house that my parents went to, and it was hard. It was a very scary environment, and I think that this caused me, in lots of ways, to turn inwards. I spent a lot of time alone, reading, playing video games, and became rather antisocial. And you know, it was sort of like, this was my world, computer games and science fiction. And I think I needed other worlds. I needed them because there wasn't a place for me in the kind of rural American reality that I was growing up in. And, you know, I also think though that I believe Carl Sagan and Donna Haraway, when they talk about our society needing science fiction because we need mythology, we need storytelling, we need speculation, a place to speculate creatively about where we are, where we might want to go, and also where we don't want to go. And so these things were very, very informative to me, the sort of need for other worlds. This is a textile, an older body of work. It is based upon a description of a textile in the novel The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. And I had sort of begun working with the TC2 in a way that a lot of folks do. It's an incredible tool. Those of you who don't know much about it, it really allows you to weave anything you want, any imagery, photographic, text-based imagery. And therein sort of lies a problem with the tool. When you can do anything you want, what do you do? And I had been very interested in my long experience with science fiction, the way that craft emerges or appears, ancient craft emerges or appears in these speculative futures, and always kind of this strange acknowledgement, I think, of history sort of projected into the future. Is something that I was engaging with. So I began this series of creating textiles from science fiction novels. This one is from a short story by Philip K. Dick called The Last of the Masters, which imagines a future in which all production is automated and craftspeople are very, very rare, sort of like these last individuals who know how to make things by hand. And you know, I had the very interesting opportunity to display this work in the office of Governor Kate Brown here in Oregon. Here's that textile sort of situated in her ceremonial office. And I love this pairing. I'll just read a little bit. My textile's in the background, and in front of it is this vitrine. And the plaques say, the vitrine which is lined with gold leaf and silk cloth, contains fragments of the lunar surface collected by American astronauts Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong during the Apollo 11 mission. The 4 fragments weigh about 0.05 grams in total. Included in the display is a diminutive synthetic fabric representation of the Oregon state flag, which traveled to the moon with the crew of the Apollo 11 for this specific symbolic purpose. The lunar rocks and flag were given to the state of Oregon by then President Richard Nixon in 1965. Similar lunar samples displays were gifted to all 50 states of the Union, as well as all countries recognized as legitimate governments of the world. The small plaque reads, "This fragment is a portion of a rock from the Taurus Littrell Valley of the moon. It is given as a symbol of the unity of human endeavor and carries with it the hope of the American people for a world at peace." I like this this pairing of this textile, which is in the background, which is kind of a stern warning from the future, sort of paired with this actual endeavor, the sort of height of our technology in the modern era of going to the moon, sort of this constant tension between our technology, our idealism, and our sort of predisposition for self-destruction. As you know, we did not go to the moon for scientific or research purposes. We went there as a display of supreme power against the Russians. So these symbolic gestures, these speculative futures, these technologies are always in this tension for me between sort of idealism and hope, but also sort of the reality of imminent destruction. And I think those tensions come up again and again in a lot of my projects. This is a scene from Star Trek Insurrection. And it's a funny scene, you know, in this film, the crew of the Enterprise, they find this planet which sort of imbues its inhabitants with unnatural sort of long life. And so they're a very peaceful society. They spend their time bettering themselves physically, mentally, spiritually, and they are weavers and quilters. And so he's admiring here this textile. He says, this is extraordinary craftsmanship. And the character, she says, it's the work of students. They're almost ready to become apprentices. In 30 or 40 years, some of them will take their place among the artisans. Apprenticing for 30 years. Jean-Luc Picard sort of says this in a very wistful way. I had gone to a craft conference in Virginia a number of years ago, and two of the keynote speakers were artists, designers who work on props, sets, for science fiction, for Star Trek, for X-Files, and they were fascinating people to listen to. And one comment they made really struck me, and it was that when they set design for narratives like Star Trek, you know, they do things like make aliens and make models and do special effects, but also they sort of dress the set of this future, you know, thousands of years, hundreds of years in the future, and try and imagine what contemporary art of the future would look like. And I love this idea, you know, sort of projecting, having to project not artwork reflective of the moment, but reflective of some distant future. And they talked a lot about this conundrum, you know, how do we sort of think beyond our times? And it has gotten me to think a lot about the appearance of mid-century modernism in science fiction as a subject that I feel is very relevant for me to consider as a person working with essentially textile design and textile processes. This, of course, is a very famous set from Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, where the set design emphasizes these extraordinary red, the gin chairs by Oliver Morg. And they are very curious because in some ways, you know, these chairs were not designed too much earlier than the film, but they're here used to project many, many hundreds of years in the future, right? And so the question is sort of why does mid-century modernism, also actually these tables are Eero Saarinen's tulip tables, why does mid-century modernism sort of have this quality of an aesthetic of the future? And, you know, one theory that I think is very interesting is that these designers were not designing for the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Their project was to design for the future, some kind of imagined ideological future. And so in our culture, in Western culture, I think they emerge as kind of like feeling timeless. We use that word to describe them. And this is a trend, you know, this is from the set of Andrei Tarkovsky's Solaris. And again, Eero Saarinen's tulip table appears here many, many hundreds of years in the future. This is a scene from the film Gattaca with Ethan Hawke. He works at in this building, which is Frank Lloyd Wright's Civic Center for Marin County. And really, if you've ever been there, yes, it does not seem like a building of this world. There is kind of an otherworldly, futuristic vibe. And I think that it is laden with this sort of idealism, which is always a problematic one. You know, that these endeavors also relate very directly to sort of a future of whiteness, a future of affluence, a future of access. It's very important, I think, that people of color do not emerge in these futures so directly occupying these spaces. And I think it is also further emphasized if you know the narrative of Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, the sort of final scene, the character is occupying this Baroque kind of Rococo space, right? So that in this final scene, which is so much about death and transcendence and rebirth, the use of the Rococo and Baroque kind of returning to like a material or bodily ecstasy, which we I think is such a brilliant kind of after these 3 hours of modern design and the kind of brutality of that minimalism. This ornament, really drives back to the experience of the body, right, of the individual, like in Bernini's Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. So this question is on my mind a lot. This question of how do artists sort of and designers sort of project into a future that is speculative and not defined yet, and how do our tools, how do we sort of align them for these purposes of speculation? Of course, my favorite character in maybe all science fiction is the HAL 9000 computer in 2001: A Space Odyssey. Again, for those of you who aren't familiar with the narrative, a supercomputer that is essentially sentient and sort of in control of all of the processes that the spacecraft that the characters are occupying. It sort of does all of the work. And this is always interesting to me. I suppose I always aligned growing up with characters that were sort of artificial intelligence or robots. I loved Data from Star Trek. I loved the doctor, the holographic doctor from Star Trek Voyager. These characters which are sort of struggling with the question of humanity. And the way that the human characters, how we interact with these tools, essentially, I think is was very informative for how I interact with the software that I write and the tools that I use. I do have a bit of a fantasy of the TC2 Loom being able to weave on its own, to sort of engage in the design process sort of without me. I have to be there a little bit, right? I still have to be human, and my interaction is what allows for the tool to create the projects I make. But I maintain this kind of curiosity about the sort of artificial creativity or computational creativity that I feel like the TC2 is a perfect tool to explore. But just for a little bit of background around these tools, Joseph Marie Jacquard was an inventor in the 17th and 18th centuries, and a very, very important, I think. There were many other inventors working on similar projects as him. Primarily, the issue was that demand for very highly patterned textile sort of reached a fever pitch, and there was a need for, within textile production, to mechanize and industrialize in order to keep up with demands. And Jacquard had the sort of insight, brilliant insight, that these complex patterns in textile could be translated into punch cards. Weaving is a binary operation. You only ever have a thread that comes up or a thread that remains down. And he was able to sort of translate that action using these punch cards. So whenever there's a hole, a thread can come up, and that pattern component is reflected in the cloth. And wherever there's no hole, the thread stays down. And this is an example of an engraving of a Jacquard loom in Massachusetts. You can see the punch cards here at the top being fed into the sort of brain of the computer. These cords then control individual warp threads, which allow for the pattern to emerge. Just as an aside, I had the really extraordinary opportunity, and actually before COVID situation, Every other summer, we bring students at the University of Oregon to the Licio Foundation in Florence, Italy, which is kind of a preeminent studio for weaving on jacquard looms. And it's great fun, but fascinating to see. These patterns sometimes are just massive. They are physically heavy. They're so heavy that actually the whole building is designed around ramps to sort of move this data, these giant piles of these cards around the studio. And so to see and to hear and to sort of experience physically the manipulation of this data is an extraordinary kind of, we sometimes have a sense of the digital or these sorts of processes being ideally very quiet and efficient, but there's so much sweat and labor involved in moving around these cards. And so, here I am with, with my pattern. I'm very excited. The interesting thing for me, of course, is the relationship between the punch card, jacquard loom, and early computers. This is IBM's 100, which is a punch card operated computer. So that this technology of expressing data through punch cards was very easily sort of translated into early computer engineering. And there's, when you see the cards next to each other, it's definitely, there's a clear sort of aesthetic relationship. And this is a fairly, there's a lot of argument around, which really came first and how close was the IBM's punch card inspired by the punch card jacquard loom. But for me, I think this is a relationship not just of sort of historic fact, but kind of a coincidence, a kind of rhyming of technologies, which I think is a more interesting way to think about it for me. Of course, now we have microchips which send binary signals instead of using these punch cards. The development of these technologies, the way I sort of approach my own practice has been trying to understand how one conceives of textile at the TC2 loom. And so traditionally, you can take, photograph, like my students, for example, they want to weave photos of their hamsters, which is fine. It's totally, I'm totally like, yes, this is how you learn how to use this tool. But for me, again, this question of being able to weave anything, how do I sort of begin that design process looking at the technology itself? And so it became very clear to me that I had to write my own software and learn about how to do that. I never got very far, but the endeavor of sort of learning about a tool, I think is really important to me, and was really instilled in me when I studied fiber and material studies at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago as an undergraduate student. If you're going to use a loom, it's important to study where the loom has come from. What loom are you using? What are the sort of socio-political histories embedded in those tools? The same is true with a sewing machine or with a dye substance you might be interested in. Where did it come from? What are the stories there? And so I guess I wanted to approach the computer in a similar way. Like I wanted to just know more intimately about this machine so that I could maybe see something in it that could inform what I would weave, right? So I played around with processing a lot, very, very fundamental, basic kind of code, and eventually had developed like a sort of toolkit of little programs. And I recently have been able to, I worked with a young programmer in London to sort of stitch all of them together into one software. I'll show you how that software works. It's not that complicated. Can you see my screen now? This is basically like an MS Paint. I don't know if people remember MS Paint, but it's like a tool where I can like draw very simple designs, and what's going on? Well, I can do all kinds of things with it, and a lot of it is kind of based in my knowledge of how surface gets translated from pixel to textile. So this is like a simple drawing tool where the computer sort of draws with me. And there are other, I'm not sure why this function isn't working right now, concentric. Yeah, so I think this should work. Yeah, so these sort of concentric forms, you know, I can create weavable designs in this space, and rather than sort of go through the process of converting a photograph or some other sort of external image into the loom, I can sort of generate the weave structures in a much more organic and intuitive way. It's much closer to drawing in this regard than the process of converting photographs into weavable files. So I spent a lot of time thinking about things like this. And so the resulting textiles from this software, you know, they look like this. The majority of really what I do is give the computer very, very minimal amounts of data, very minimal amounts of graphical information, and I let it populate the rest of the design with its own sort of algorithmic ideas. I won't go too deeply into how each of these is designed, but this notion of collaborating with the software to produce the textile, I think is sort of core to all of these works. And of course, they transform really dramatically from pixel to thread. The sort of physicality, the way that you know, the thread is not an illusion of a pictorial space, but it is an arrangement of physical thread objects, allows for very, very interesting, almost holographic kinds of qualities to emerge. So in this work, as the viewer moves around it, there are very subtle shadows and shifts of light. So again, returning to this physicality, I think, is important for me as someone who's exploring these digital tools. So as I was working, you know, learning how to code a little bit and working with programmers, I was reading a lot about the history of computers, and you know, something that came up for me. I became very interested in the Institute for Advanced Study in New Jersey and the supercomputer there, which was really designed in lots of ways for the calculation and plotting of blast yields and trajectories of weapons of mass destruction during the Second World War. So that computer, you know, again, this tension between the technology and kind of idealism, and also the sort of imminent destruction came up again in this research. And I was very moved. You know, here's an image of the IAS computer. I was very interested in, you know, after the war, these are some of the programmers who worked on the IAS computer, designing it. After the war, the scientists, you know, the US government sort of allowed the scientists to use the computer in a much more open way. They were sort of like, they basically sent out a call to scientists of the world. You know, we have this extraordinarily powerful computer, give us your unsolvable problems. And one of the projects they chose was by the mathematician and biologist Niels Albericelli. And his proposal was, his research was in sort of understanding the evolution of single-celled organisms. He wanted to sort of create a model to prove Darwin's theory of evolution mathematically. And so they're great, come do this. And his research basically centered around programming what he called bionumeric organisms. And these were little numerical packets of information that had instructions on various forms of interaction and mutation. So that what you're seeing on the right is a numerical printout of each of these little numbers is an organism, and you can see that how they interact, how they grow, how they die, how they combine, how they die off, build communities. And so each line is sort of a generation, one generation of these bionumeric organisms. And frankly, I don't understand all the mathematics. I've had a lot of programmer friends talk me through what's going on here, but I was more struck by this poetics that this computer could, in one instance, be used to create the most destructive force our species has endeavored to create, but then immediately be used to sort of understand the origins of life. And those poetics, I think, it just stuck with me in a way that for the subsequent 3 years, I could not let it go. And so what I decided to do was use his software to work with the programmer, his name is Michael Mack, to translate Baricelli's code to, instead of appear as numbers, appear as weave structures. And so I have been using this code to essentially grow, bionumerically grow these patterns. And in some ways, they are kind of genealogies, right? They are records of these organisms as they are born and interact and die over time. And I was really struck by, I believe the writer George Dyson, who is a scholar of computer history, how that these pictures, these images of bionumeric organisms, he described them as abstractions of Darwin's theory of evolution. And that language really struck me in terms of our historical reference to abstraction, that the sort of abstract expressionists, the proto-abstract expressionists really emphasized, like Lee Krasner has emphasized, you must abstract from life. You can't abstract from nowhere. And that sort of painterly notion of abstracting from life feels very in line with what these have become. And I can show you very quickly, I know I'm doing fine with time. I'll show you what the BioLoom software looks like and how I designed these. I won't explain. This is Unity, which is a coding environment for games and other applications. But essentially, what I can do. Let's run this as. So I can essentially, what you're seeing here is more like Baricelli's original software. It's showing this first line here is a generation, first generation, it's all numbers. And then each subsequent generation, again, you can sort of start mapping how they interact and create these patterns. But what I found I could do is, rather than dress the bionumeric organisms as a color and a number, I could dress them as a weave structure. So in this case, we can put them in a costume of bird's eye twill. And so they look like this as a bird's eye twill. And so this can go directly to the loom and be woven there. There are also all kinds of other sort of effects that I have talked with the programmer through. And, there's this idea that, Baricelli, the IAS computer had very limited memory, a very limited capacity to, so he could only really ask very few questions, but with the computing power we have now, I'm able to sort of ask the organisms different questions. So here's Baricelli's original This is like his original code, exactly as is published in his paper. And he was seeking harmony. He was hoping for the organisms to evolve to a point of like sustainability, essentially. But so you can think about the organisms as being very harmonious and sort of cooperating. When they're limited resources, things get a bit hairy, but they always sort of tend towards harmony. What if we don't give them that clear of instruction on how to interact? So different kinds of attitudes emerge. The organisms here, some of them it's averaging out as opposed to seeking balance. So there's a more, it ends up with a more dominant, there's a more dominant organism at the end. And these are questions actually that the programmer, that Michael, my collaborator, asked me, and this is sort of great, collaborating with him, because these are not questions I would know how to ask if I were not thinking mathematically about what was happening in the paper, right? He could see that Baricelli could only ask this limited number of questions because of the computing power and because he didn't have that much time. But, Michael is like, we can ask different questions of these organisms and have them do different things. So it's great fun. I spent a lot of my time sort of in a rather meditative state, seeing these creatures come in and out of existence. But yes, I would love to talk more technically about what's going on. This software is sort of ongoing project, and it's really great because I was very happy when I was able to think of the analogy that they're wearing like a costume of a weave structure. I think that makes it very clear sort of what's actually happening to them. So that brings me to the show at Holding Now. Again, as I've been making, as I've been doing this research, and on the one hand, I can become so obsessed with the technicality and kind of the history and the anecdotes and the narratives around the science. But for me, they are abstractions of life. They are spacious in that way. I think of these as alive, and that is really reflected in the materiality of how they are presented. They are under kind of tension on the wall. They occupy the space, the sort of vernacular space of abstraction, and I think that is sort of right. That's sort of right for what Baricelli's intentions were, and for the way I would like the viewer to be able to relate with them. That they are sort of pictures of this sliver of history, the history that happens, in a computational blink of an eye, and then they're captured here. And to give them the spaciousness, I think is respectful of these sort of digital life forms. I guess I'll end here, and I'm really excited to answer your questions. But I will say that as we continue to sort of navigate our technological adolescence, this sort of moment in our history where our technology is so it so exceeds our capacity to know it intimately. And for me, the endeavor of survival is linked to the endeavor of knowing more intimately the tools that are around us. And I hope I'm doing that really for myself, but I also hope that some sort of curiosity around these tools and these technologies, I hope I can impart that to my students, or that the work sort of begins a conversation about these technologies. So thank you so much for your attention. And yes, if there are any questions, I haven't looked at the chat, but I would be happy to answer them.
Can you all hear me? Jovencio?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, so we don't actually have any questions in the chat yet, but I do encourage you all to contribute to that. I have a question where I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the title of the exhibition.
Oh, yes. So it's so funny. We had scheduled this exhibition earlier in the year, but like so many exhibitions, it was rescheduled because of the COVID crisis. And in the interim, so I had everything. I knew what I wanted to show. I had all the work. I'd written a different program, and I was so excited to show this other body of work. But then this happened, and then I got things got shifted around. Cumulative Shadow. I don't know if I have an image of it in my presentation, actually. I can grab it from my screen. So this work on the left is in, can you all see this? Yeah, this work is in the exhibition. This was a very simple drawing tool I was working with. Originally, I had a good friend, his name is Nathan Williams. He worked for Nintendo for a lot of years, and he had described just sort of anecdotally this problem of in gaming design, this conundrum of when figures are moving around in a computer game and they cast a shadow, shadows that overlap should produce a darker shadow. And this was a problem he was working on. And I loved it. I love this problem because it is such we so take for granted perhaps that is happening in our lived experience, but for a programmer or designer to like capture that kind of essential quality of light and space in a virtual world was so compelling to me. And so I tried to mimic that using this drawing tool, which sort of worked with transparencies. These are all woven in raffia also. And I had designed this, I've designed this this little drawing tool while I was in residency at Crow Shadow Center for Arts in Pendleton, Oregon, and struck by the history of violence inflicted on Indigenous communities and the ongoing sort of racial unfolding that was happening in the nation that continues to happen. And maybe light and shadow, light and dark, these kind of qualities of hope and crisis. I can't really say too much more about it, I think.
Thank you. Well, actually, so it might be easier to have people ask their questions directly. So if you all do want to if you do have a question, just put your name in the chat and we can have you speak if you prefer that. Hi, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jovencio.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah.
My dog was quiet the entire time, even though he was disruptive in the beginning. I don't know if everyone could hear that. Anyway, but I learned so much every time. And I feel like one of your students, or I feel lucky that I get to have these, hear these presentations, and there's always this new line of thinking, and I learn more every time. I love this presentation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Well, if there are no questions, I hope that folks can see the show in person. And yeah, thank you so much, Tiff and Iris, for everything that you do. It's extraordinary to work with the both of you, and that you have kept it going during this really challenging year. It's a great joy to work with the both of you.
Thanks so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And yeah, hope to see those of you who haven't been able to visit, make an appointment to come in to the gallery. The show is up through May 29th, and we're open Fridays and Saturdays. And also Jovencio has a show coming up, a group exhibition at Cranbrook Museum I think it's in June, is that right? Yeah, so you can look out for that information. So thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you soon.